I took the cabin because I needed the quiet. That was the only thing on my mind when I made the decision. After months of stress at work, late nights, and constant emails, my body had started showing signs that it was shutting down. My heart raced at random times. My head felt heavy even when I got a full night's sleep, and my stomach churned every time my phone vibrated. My doctor told me it was anxiety. My boss called it burnout. Either way, I couldn't function like this anymore. The cabin belonged to my uncle. He barely used it, so when I told him I needed a place to get away, he handed me the key without hesitation. "No service up there," he said, "but there's a landline if you need it. Should be some canned food in the pantry too." That was all I needed to hear. No service meant no distractions. I could finally breathe. The drive up was longer than I expected. The last town I passed through was nothing more than a gas station and a few boarded-up buildings. The road twisted through dense trees, and the farther I went, the worse the pavement got. By the time I reached the cabin, my tires were kicking up more gravel than asphalt. It was a simple place, one story, dark wood, small porch out front. The windows were dirty, the roof looked like it could use some work, and the steps creaked when I put my weight on them. It smelled damp inside, but that wasn't surprising. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and dust. I opened a few windows, let the fresh air in. The furniture was basic. A couch that looked older than me, a coffee table with water rings stained into it, a fireplace that hadn't been used in years. The kitchen was even smaller than I expected, with a single burner stove and an ancient fridge that rattled when it ran. There were 2 doors in the back of the cabin. One led to a tiny bedroom with a twin bed and a dresser missing a drawer. The other led to a bathroom where the mirror had rust creeping up its edges. Everything was exactly what I needed. Simple, quiet, isolated. That first night I felt good. I sat on the porch with a beer, listening to the wind push through the trees. It was the first time in months that I didn't feel like my chest was about to cave in. The stars were so clear out here, the air so crisp, the silence so perfect. I slept like a rock. It was the second night that I noticed it. I woke up cold, not just chilly, freezing. My breath came out in a cloud. The cabin wasn't well insulated, and I had a single thin blanket, but this felt unnatural. The air had a sharp bite to it, like I had left a window open, but when I checked, they were all shut tight. I got up, grabbed my jacket, and went to the bathroom. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and I made a mental note to check for loose planks in the morning. When I flicked the bathroom light on, I froze. The mirror was fogged over. That didn't make sense. The cabin was ice cold. There was no heat, no steam. My stomach knotted up as I reached out and wiped a hand across the glass. My own reflection stared back at me, tired and pale. I shook off the unease, chalked it up to my mind playing tricks, and went back to bed. The next morning, I checked the weather. The temperature had dropped overnight, but not enough to explain how cold the cabin had gotten. I shrugged it off, made some coffee, and spent the day hiking the trails behind the property. The trees were thick, the forest dense, but the paths were well worn. My uncle had warned me not to stray too far. "Easy to get turned around," he had said. "One wrong turn, and you'll be wandering for hours." I stuck to the main trail, keeping an eye on the sun as I walked. It felt good to move, to breathe air that didn't taste like city smog. By the time I got back, the sun was starting to dip, and my legs were sore. I made a simple dinner, read for a while, and turned in early. That night, the cold came back. I woke up with my teeth chattering. I could see my breath again. The blankets were pulled up to my chin, but they did nothing to keep out the chill. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. When I stayed in the city, there was always some kind of noise, traffic, people, sirens in the distance. Even in the suburbs, you could hear dogs barking, wind moving through trees. But here, in this cabin, in the middle of nowhere, there was nothing. Just silence. The kind that pressed against your ears and made your own breathing sound too loud. I got up and checked the windows again. Locked. The door? Locked. The fireplace? Ice cold. I turned on the old radiator heater in the corner, but it barely hummed to life. Useless. I added another layer of clothes and crawled back under the blankets. Sleep didn't come easy after that. The days passed, but the cold remained. It was always worse at night, creeping into my bones, making my muscles stiff. I started leaving the lights on when I slept. I told myself it was just the isolation messing with me. My brain was playing tricks, making me uneasy. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Then I found the cellar. I was cleaning up the kitchen when I moved the rug near the sink and saw the handle. A metal ring set into the floor, slightly rusted. My stomach turned. I hadn't seen a mention of a basement in the cabin's layout. My uncle hadn't mentioned it either. I told myself it was just a storage space, but my hands were shaking when I pulled the door up. The air that came out was damp and stale. A ladder led down into darkness. I grabbed my flashlight and hesitated before descending. The cellar was small, with stone walls and a dirt floor. There were shelves lining the walls, filled with old jars, tools, and things I didn't recognize. And then I saw the chair. It sat in the middle of the room, plain and wooden, but the floor around it was scratched up, deep gouges in the dirt, the kind made by something struggling. My throat tightened, my flashlight flickered, and for a brief second, the shadows seemed to shift. I turned and climbed out fast, slamming the door shut behind me. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I left the next morning, packed my bag, locked the cabin, and drove without stopping until I was hours away. I called my uncle when I got to a motel. I asked him about the cellar. There was a long pause before he answered. Then, in a quiet voice, he simply said, "I never put a cellar in that cabin." I hung up and never went back. I never liked the idea of staying in a cabin. It always seemed like one of those things that people romanticized. Cozying up by the fire, listening to the rain, drinking something warm while wrapped in a blanket. But when you're alone, in the middle of nowhere, all of that feels different. The silence isn't peaceful. It's too much. It feels like something is waiting in it. The cabin wasn't mine. It belonged to my uncle. He owned a decent stretch of land out in the mountains, a good 2-hour drive from the nearest town. When he passed, the place was left abandoned, and no one in the family wanted to deal with it. I was the only one who ever really went up there, not because I liked it, but because I knew someone had to check in every now and then, make sure no animals had broken in, no squatters were hiding out. My uncle wasn't a people person, so no one ever visited him when he was alive. And now that he was gone, the place just sat there, sinking deeper into the woods. It had been almost a year since my last visit. I kept putting it off, telling myself there was no rush. The place wasn't going anywhere, but eventually guilt got to me, so I packed up for a weekend trip, just a couple nights to make sure everything was in order. I took my truck, loaded it up with some supplies, and made the drive out. The road leading up was a mess. Years of neglect had made it rougher than I remembered. The dirt had eroded away in places, deep ruts making it almost impossible to drive over without feeling like my teeth were going to shake loose. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, I was exhausted from fighting the wheel the whole way. The place looked the same as always. A small, squat thing with a metal roof, weathered with siding, and a front porch that creaked if you even looked at it too hard. The forest had grown up thick around it, pressing in like it was trying to reclaim the land. I stepped out of the truck and stretched, listening to the quiet. It was deep, no wind, no birds, nothing but the faint ticking of the truck's engine cooling down. I grabbed my bag and made my way up the steps, unlocking the door and pushing it open. The air inside was stale. The cabin was just one big room with a small kitchen area to the left, a fireplace in the middle, and a cot pushed up against the far wall. No bathroom, no running water, just a wood stove and an old metal sink with a water pump that barely worked. I set my bag down on the cot and started checking the place over. The roof was still holding up, no signs of leaks. The windows were dirty but unbroken. I found a couple of mouse droppings in the corners, but that was expected. What bothered me was the smell. It was faint, almost like something had gone bad a long time ago and had been left to rot. I checked under the cot, behind the kitchen cabinets, even in the little storage area by the back wall. Nothing. No dead animal. No food left out. Just that smell, clinging to the air like it was soaked into the walls. I tried to ignore it. I spent the rest of the day splitting some firewood, sweeping out dust, and making sure the door and windows locked properly. The sun went down fast out there. 1 minute, there was light filtering through the trees, and the next, it was gone. The cabin didn't have electricity, so I lit a couple of lanterns and sat by the fire, eating a can of cold beans. The quiet was worse at night. Every little sound made my skin crawl. The way the fire popped, the occasional creak of the wood settling. Even my own breathing felt too loud. I had planned to stay up, maybe read a book or something, but I was too on edge. So I crawled into the cot, pulled the blanket up to my chest, and shut my eyes. I woke up in the middle of the night. I don't know what time it was, but the fire had burned down to embers, and the cabin was cold. I stayed still, listening. I didn't hear anything at first, just that heavy silence. But then, there it was, soft, careful footsteps outside the cabin. My first thought was a deer, but these weren't the random, clumsy steps of an animal. They were slow, deliberate. I sat up, my heart hammering. The footsteps moved toward the front porch. One step, then another. Then they stopped. I waited. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to move, to do something, but I couldn't. I just sat there, barely breathing. Then the floorboards creaked. Someone was on the porch, standing right outside the door. I reached down slowly, grabbing the old hunting knife my uncle had left behind. My hands were shaking. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps moved away. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, knife in hand, listening to every sound. But nothing else happened. When the sun finally rose, I threw on my boots and went outside. The ground was damp from the night air, and I saw them immediately. Footprints in the dirt. Not boot prints, bare feet, long, thin toes pressed into the mud. They led from the tree line up to the porch, then back again. I didn't pack up. I didn't check anything else. I just grabbed my bag, threw it into the truck, and left. I didn't stop driving until I was back home. I never went back to the cabin after that. I told my family they could sell it, burn it down, do whatever they wanted. But I was done. I don't know who or what was out there that night, and I don't want to know. I don't know what made me say yes. Maybe it was the stress from work, or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I could do something alone for once. Either way, I found myself driving up a winding dirt road, miles away from anything, heading toward a small, isolated cabin deep in the woods. I had rented it for the weekend, just 2 nights. It was supposed to be peaceful, just me, a book, and the quiet. The cabin was old, but it looked sturdy. A simple wooden structure with a small front porch, a single window facing the road, and a slanted roof that looked like it could barely hold up under a heavy rain. The trees surrounding it were thick, closing in from every side. I turned off my car, stepped out, and breathed in the cool, crisp air. The silence was immediate and heavy, as if the world had been muted the moment my tires stopped crunching on the gravel. Inside, the cabin was small but functional. A twin bed with a thin mattress, a tiny kitchenette with an old fridge and a 2-burner stove, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a single bathroom at the back. No television, no Wi-Fi, barely any phone signal. That was the point. I wanted to unplug, to be away from the stress of daily life, even just for a couple of days. The first evening was fine. I made a simple meal, sat on the porch as the sun went down, and listened to the sounds of the forest. I could hear the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional snap of a branch as some animal moved through the woods. It was peaceful, exactly what I had wanted. It was sometime in the middle of the night when I woke up. At first, I didn't know what had startled me. I lay there, staring at the wooden ceiling, listening. The cabin was silent, too silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears strain, waiting for something, anything, to break it. Then I heard it, a soft, slow creak from outside. Could have been the wind, I told myself. The cabin was old, after all. But then it came again. A deliberate sound. The sound of weight shifting on wood. I sat up, heart pounding. My first thought was that maybe it was an animal, a raccoon or a stray dog sniffing around the porch. I forced myself to relax. But then came another sound. This one closer. A soft thud, like a footstep just outside the front door. I reached for my phone, but of course, I had barely any signal. Just a single bar that flickered in and out. I didn't want to turn on the light. If someone was out there, I didn't want them to know I was awake. I crept out of bed as quietly as I could, my bare feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. The window by the front door had no curtain, so I inched toward it, pressing myself against the wall, trying to peek outside without being seen. The porch was empty. The trees stood still in the darkness, their branches barely moving in the faint wind. Nothing, no movement, no sign of anything. I let out a slow breath, feeling ridiculous. Maybe I had just imagined it. Maybe it was a deer passing through, its hooves making noises on the old wood. I told myself to go back to bed, to stop being paranoid. The rest of the night was quiet, but I barely slept. Every sound, every creak, made my nerves tighten. When the sun finally rose, I felt stupid for being so on edge. In the daylight, the fear seemed silly, just my mind playing tricks on me. I stepped outside to get some fresh air and looked around. The porch was empty, just as I had seen the night before. The dirt road leading up to the cabin was untouched. No tire tracks, no footprints. Everything was normal. I shook off the unease and told myself to relax. The second day passed quietly. I went for a walk, following a narrow trail that wound through the woods behind the cabin. It was beautiful in a lonely kind of way. Tall trees, fallen leaves crunching beneath my boots, the distant sound of birds chirping somewhere high above. For the first time since arriving, I felt like I was truly alone. And for a little while, I liked it. By the time I got back, the sun was already dipping below the trees. The air had turned cold, and the shadows stretched long across the ground. I went inside, locked the door, and made myself another simple meal. As the darkness settled in, the uneasy feeling crept back. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself that nothing had happened the night before, that I was just being paranoid. But then, around midnight, it happened again. This time, the sound was louder, clearer. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch. I sat up in bed, every muscle in my body going rigid. It wasn't an animal. I knew that now. Animals don't move like that, don't walk with such measured steps. My heart pounded as I stared at the door, waiting, listening. Then came the sound of the doorknob rattling. My breath caught in my throat. Someone was trying to get in. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I just sat there, frozen, as the doorknob turned again. Slowly, testing. The lock held, but the sound of it sent a wave of pure terror through me. My mind raced. Who was out there? What did they want? Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. I sat there for what felt like hours, waiting, listening. But nothing happened. No more footsteps. No more sounds. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I packed my things. I didn't care that I had paid for another night. I didn't care that it was broad daylight and everything looked normal again. I was leaving. I stepped outside, my bag slung over my shoulder, and that's when I saw them. Footprints. Clear, human footprints in the dirt, leading up to the porch, leading to my door. But the thing that made my stomach drop? There were no footprints leading away. I didn't stop to think. I didn't stop to look around. I just got in my car, started the engine, and drove. I didn't even breathe properly until I was miles away, back on the main road, civilization in sight. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted or why they stopped. But I do know one thing. I will never go back to that cabin again. I never wanted to go to the cabin alone. It was a favor for my uncle, a simple request to check on his property while he was out of state. He'd been worried about vandals breaking in, so I agreed to drive up for the weekend. just a quick trip. Get in, check the place, and leave by Sunday morning. The cabin sat deep in the woods, about 20 miles off the nearest highway. The roads were mostly gravel, winding through thick trees that swallowed the last bit of daylight. By the time I reached the property, the sun had set completely, and the cabin stood there, dark and lifeless. A single security light hung over the porch, buzzing softly, casting just enough glow to see the front door. I parked the car and killed the engine. The sudden silence made my skin crawl. No cars, no voices, just the wind pushing through the trees, rustling the leaves in quick bursts. I grabbed my duffel bag, the keys, and my flashlight, then made my way up the steps. The cabin smelled like dust and wood. The air inside was stale, like no one had been there in months. I flicked on the lights, but only one of the ceiling bulbs worked, casting dim light over the living room. The furniture was covered in white sheets, protecting it from dust, but there were footprints on the wooden floor. That wasn't right. I hesitated, scanning the room. The footprints weren't mine. They were dried into the thin layer of dust, leading from the front door toward the hallway. I tried to tell myself it was probably my uncle's from his last visit, but something felt off. I set my bag down and walked toward the prints, following them carefully. They led past the kitchen, toward the back of the house, and stopped in front of the bedroom door. I hesitated, my heart pounding hard against my ribs. The door was open just a crack. I pushed it wider with my foot and shined my flashlight inside. Nothing, just the same old furniture, the same bed with its thin mattress, and the same wooden dresser against the wall. Everything looked untouched. I swallowed hard and turned back to the living room, locking the front door behind me. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe I was overreacting. I tried to relax, making a quick meal from the canned goods my uncle kept in the kitchen. The place had no Wi-Fi, no cell signal. Just me, my own thoughts, and the quiet hum of the refrigerator. After eating, I double-checked the locks, made sure the windows were secure, then grabbed my duffel and headed to the bedroom. The night was restless. The forest outside was loud, branches creaking, leaves shifting, occasional animal sounds. Every noise made my skin crawl. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up suddenly to something. A sound came from the kitchen, a slow, deliberate creak. My body stiffened. I held my breath, listening. The house was silent again, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. Someone was in the cabin. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it so tight my knuckles ached. The bedroom door was still closed, but I hadn't locked it. I moved slowly, creeping toward the door, straining to hear anything past my own heartbeat. Another sound, this time closer. I turned the knob and opened the door just a fraction, peering through the gap. The living room was dark except for the weak glow from the security light outside. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. I stepped out, keeping my flashlight pointed downward to avoid drawing attention. The kitchen light was on. I hadn't left it on. A chair had been pulled away from the table. I knew I hadn't touched it. My stomach twisted. I stepped forward, moving carefully, slowly. Every step felt like it took an hour. The back door was unlocked. That's when I saw it, just outside the door, in the dirt near the steps. Footprints, fresh ones, leading away from the cabin. Someone had been inside with me. My hands shook as I locked the door, checking it twice, 3 times. I moved back to the living room, scanning the windows, but everything was still. The night outside looked the same, dark and endless. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the living room with my flashlight, waiting for the first sign of daylight. Every sound, every creak, every whisper of wind felt like a threat. By sunrise, I had my bags packed. I didn't care about my uncle's favor anymore. I just needed to leave. When I stepped outside, the cold morning air hit my face. The forest was quiet now, like nothing had ever happened. I hurried to my car, threw my bag in the passenger seat, and slid behind the wheel. I turned the key. Nothing. I turned it again. The engine sputtered, then died. My pulse pounded in my ears. I tried again, but the car wouldn't start. I popped the hood, got out, and checked. but I didn't know what I was looking for. Everything looked fine. No loose wires, no obvious problems. Then I saw it. The fuel line had been cut. Cleanly, precisely. Someone had made sure I couldn't leave. A sound came from the trees behind me. A slow rustling, like footsteps through dry leaves. I turned fast, my heart slamming against my ribs. Nothing, just trees, just shadows. But I knew better. Someone was out there. I grabbed my duffel and started running. The gravel road stretched ahead, empty, winding through the woods. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I ran until my legs burned, until my breath came in ragged gasps. I ran until I saw the highway where a single truck passed by. I waved my arms, screaming, and the driver hit the brakes. I never told my uncle what happened. I made up some excuse about the car breaking down, about getting a ride back to town. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who was out there. I don't want to know. All I know is that someone was watching me, and they didn't want me to leave. I don't know why I agreed to go. Maybe it was the stress, maybe it was the nagging feeling that I needed to prove something to myself. Maybe I was just tired of saying no. Either way, I packed up my gear and drove out to a cabin in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by thick Indiana woods. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. Just me, the sound of the trees, and the distant trickle of a nearby creek. The cabin belonged to a guy from work. He told me it had been in his family for years, passed down from his grandfather. It's not fancy, he had said, but it's got the basics. No Wi-Fi, no cell signal. You want to get away from the world, that's the place to do it. That sounded good to me at the time. No distractions, just time to think. Took longer than I expected to get there. The road wound through miles of forest, the trees thick and pressing in from both sides. The gravel drive leading up to the cabin was nearly overgrown, weeds creeping up the sides like they were trying to reclaim it. The cabin itself was old, built from heavy logs, the roof sagging a little in places. I parked, got out, and took a deep breath. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. No sounds but the wind in the trees and the occasional creak of branches. Felt still, too still, like something was waiting. Inside, the place was exactly what I expected, bare bones but functional. A wooden table with mismatched chairs, a stone fireplace with a pile of wood beside it, a small kitchen with an old gas stove, a single bed pushed against the far wall, covered in a musty old quilt. The only light came from a few dusty oil lamps, since the place didn't have electricity. I set my things down, took out a lantern, and lit it. The soft glow made the space feel smaller, the shadows heavier. I tried to shake the feeling creeping up my spine. It was just a cabin, just an old building in the woods. Nothing to be nervous about. After settling in, I went outside to gather more firewood. The sun was starting to dip, sending long shadows stretching between the trees. I walked a little way into the woods, just enough to grab some dry branches. The silence was deeper out there. No birds, no rustling, just the sound of my own footsteps crunching the leaves. That's when I saw them. Footprints, not mine. They were fresh, leading away from the cabin and disappearing into the trees. I froze, my heart hammering. The prints were deep, made by someone heavier than me. Boots, not animal tracks. Someone had been here, recently. I looked around, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. Just the endless stretch of trunks and shadows. The air felt thick, pressing in on me. Slowly, I backed away, moving toward the cabin, gripping the bundle of wood in my arms so tight my fingers ached. Inside, I bolted the door and checked the windows. All locked. I forced myself to take deep breaths. Maybe it was an old trail. Maybe the guy who owned the cabin had been out here recently. Maybe it was nothing. The wind picked up outside, rattling the trees. I lit a fire in the fireplace, the warmth doing little to chase away the unease crawling through me. I told myself I was being paranoid. I just needed sleep. But sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of the wind, set my nerves on edge. At some point, Exhaustion won out, and I drifted into a fitful doze. A noise woke me, not the wind, not the trees, something else. I lay still, listening, my heart hammering in my chest. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, right outside the cabin. I reached for the lantern, careful not to make a sound. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The footsteps stopped. Then, a soft scrape against the wooden door. I held my breath. Someone was out there, standing just beyond the thin barrier of wood. Another scrape, like fingers dragging over the surface. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move. I reached for the rifle the cabin owner had left behind, my hands slick with sweat. My mind raced. Who would be out here? Why would they be lurking outside a remote cabin in the middle of the night? The sound stopped. Silence stretched. I strained to listen, my whole body rigid. Then a slow creak. The porch. Whoever it was, they were still there, waiting. I gripped the rifle tighter, my breathing shallow. Minutes passed, maybe more. The fire crackled. The only sound in the thick, pressing quiet. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Finally, the sound of footsteps again, moving away this time, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I sat by the fire until dawn, my back against the wall, the rifle across my lap. When the sun finally rose, I hesitated before stepping outside. The footprints were there, clear in the damp earth. They circled the cabin, paused by the door, then disappeared into the trees. Whoever it was had been watching, waiting. I didn't stay. I packed my things, loaded my gear into the car, and left without looking back. I never told the guy from work what happened, never asked if he'd ever seen anything out there. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't the only one in those woods that night. I don't know why I agreed to stay in that cabin. It wasn't mine. It wasn't even a rental. It belonged to my uncle, a man I barely knew, a man who only called me when he needed something. He was heading out of the country for some job. I never asked what he did, and he needed someone to keep an eye on his place for a few weeks. I had just quit my job, was living alone, and had nothing better to do, so I said yes. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. My uncle had built it himself years ago, far from the nearest town, with no neighbors in sight, just trees and silence. I figured it would be nice, peaceful, even a break from my normal life. I arrived just before dark, following his vague directions down winding dirt roads. The place was exactly what I expected. A single-story wooden structure, weathered but sturdy, with a small porch and a tin roof. It sat in a clearing surrounded by thick trees. No driveway, just a patch of flattened grass where he parked his truck. I pulled up next to it and turned off my car. The air was still, the sky a dull gray. The inside was simple. One main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a bedroom. The walls were lined with hunting trophies. Deer heads, antlers, even a stuffed coyote mounted above the fireplace. The air smelled like wood and dust, the kind of smell that seeps into the walls over time. I dropped my bag in the bedroom and checked my phone. No service, not even a single bar. That wasn't surprising. My uncle had warned me about it, said he used a radio when he needed to talk to someone. It was sitting on the kitchen counter, a big old thing with knobs and dials. I didn't touch it. That first night was uneventful. I made some canned soup, read a book by lantern light, then went to bed early. The silence outside was different from what I was used to. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, no dogs barking. Just the wind through the trees, the occasional creak of the cabin settling. Took me a while to fall asleep. I woke up to a sound I couldn't place. Not loud, but distinct. A soft, deliberate scraping against the outside of the cabin. I stayed still, listening. Came again. Something moving along the wall, near the bedroom window. I told myself it was a branch. The wind, maybe an animal. But it didn't move like an animal. The sound was steady, slow, like something dragging across the wood. I sat up and looked at the window. too dark to see anything outside. The sound stopped. I waited, heart pounding, but it didn't come back. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing and went back to sleep. The next morning, I went outside to check. There were no branches near the cabin walls. Nothing that could have made that noise. The ground was mostly hard-packed dirt, but near the window, I saw something. Footprints. Not boots. Not shoes. Bare feet. They led away from the cabin into the trees. I stared at them for a long time. They were small, like a child's, but too deep for a kid to have made. I followed them a few steps, but they disappeared into the undergrowth. I told myself someone had been passing through. Some hiker, maybe, though I hadn't seen a single sign of another person since I got there. Still, I tried to brush it off. That day, I kept busy. Chopped some firewood, read some more, went for a short walk around the property. The unease from the night before faded. I even convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing. Then night came again. I locked the door, made sure the windows were shut, and went to bed early. This time, I woke up to something different. Not a sound, but a feeling, like someone was watching me. I turned on the bedside lamp and looked around. The room was empty. The door was closed, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps on the porch. Slow, careful. I sat up, heart hammering. The footsteps stopped right outside the bedroom window. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then a single tap on the glass. Light, deliberate. I wanted to look, but I couldn't. I stayed frozen, waiting. The tapping came again. And then, after a long pause, I heard the footsteps move away. I stayed awake the rest of the night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my bag, grabbed my keys, and walked out to my car. The air was cold, the sky overcast. I reached for the door handle, then stopped. The back door was open. I knew I had locked it. I felt sick. I looked inside. Nothing seemed missing, but something was off. The driver's seat was pushed back, like someone taller than me had sat there. I slammed the door shut and got in. The engine turned over. I threw it into reverse, spinning the tires on the damp ground, and tore down the dirt road. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. Didn't check my phone until I was halfway back to town. When I finally got service, I called my uncle. He didn't answer. I left him a message, told him what had happened, told him I wasn't going back. He never called me back. A few weeks later, he sent me a text. Just one line. Should have told you about the man in the woods. I never responded. I don't know why I agreed to it. Maybe it was the exhaustion from work or the pressure from my brother, Jake, constantly telling me I needed a break. Maybe I really did think a few days in the woods would do me some good. Either way, I found myself driving deep into the forest, following the directions he sent me. He was supposed to meet me there, but his text earlier said he was running late. I didn't mind. I figured I'd have time to settle in before he arrived. The cabin was nothing fancy, just a small, single-story structure surrounded by thick trees, sitting at the edge of a lake. It looked old but sturdy, with dark wooden walls and a stone chimney that probably hadn't been used in years. The driveway was just a patch of dirt and gravel, barely wide enough for my truck. There were no other cabins in sight, just the trees, the lake, and the silence. I got out and stretched, taking in the crisp autumn air. The place was quiet, too quiet. No wind, no birds, just the occasional creak of branches shifting. I grabbed my bag from the truck, locked the doors out of habit, and made my way to the front porch. The key was under the doormat, exactly where Jake said it would be. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust and old wood. The furniture was basic, an old couch, a small table, a single bed against the far wall. There was a tiny kitchen with a rusted sink, a mini fridge, and a two-burner stove. A single door led to what I assumed was the bathroom. Everything felt outdated, but it was clean enough. I dropped my bag on the couch and checked my phone. No service. Not surprising. Jake had mentioned the reception out here was spotty at best. I figured I'd try again later and went to look around outside. The lake was about 50 yards from the cabin, calm and still. The water was dark, reflecting the gray sky above. There was a small wooden dock, half rotten and leaning slightly to one side. I walked out onto it, testing each step carefully. The boards creaked but held my weight. I stood there for a moment, looking out over the water. Something about it made me uneasy. I couldn't explain why, but I didn't like it. I shook the feeling off and went back to the cabin. Still no sign of Jake. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. I lit the lanterns inside, since the place didn't have electricity, and made myself a sandwich from the cooler I brought. As I ate, I kept glancing at my phone, hoping for a message, but nothing came through. By the time it was fully dark, I started to worry. Jake was supposed to be here hours ago. I told myself he probably just got caught up with something and would show up soon. But as the night stretched on, doubt crept in. I stepped outside, listening for any sign of an approaching car, but all I heard was the distant hoot of an owl and the rustling of leaves. I tried to sleep, but it was no use. The bed was uncomfortable, and every little noise made me sit up, heart pounding. Around midnight, I heard something outside, a faint crunch of leaves, like footsteps. I froze, listening. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin. I reached for my flashlight and shone it through the window, but saw nothing. Still, the feeling of being watched was impossible to shake. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, gripping the flashlight, barely breathing. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off. When I woke, the sun was just starting to rise. My heart nearly stopped when I looked out the window. Footprints, dozens of them circling the cabin. I rushed outside, my pulse hammering in my ears. The prints were fresh, leading from the tree line, looping around the cabin, then back into the woods. I crouched down, studying them, barefoot. Whoever had been out here wasn't wearing shoes. Panic set in. I grabbed my phone, but there was still no service. I ran to my truck, threw open the door, and turned the key. Nothing, not even a click. I tried again. The truck was dead. My breathing turned shallow. I popped the hood, but I wasn't a mechanic. I had no idea what was wrong. It had been fine yesterday. Now nothing. I stood there trying to think. I had food and water for a couple of days, but no way to contact anyone. The nearest town was over 20 miles away. I could hike it, but something about those footprints made my skin crawl. Someone had been here last night. Someone watching me. The thought of being out in the open alone with whoever that was, I couldn't do it. Not yet. I needed to think. I spent the day checking over the truck, looking for anything obvious. The battery connections were fine, no loose wires. It didn't make sense. I tried my phone again, nothing. I walked up the road a bit, hoping for better reception, but the signal never came. That night, I locked every door and window, pushing the couch in front of the door just in case. I kept my flashlight and a hunting knife from my bag next to me. Sleep didn't come easy. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. I gripped the knife so hard my knuckles ached. The sound moved to the front porch. Then a knock. 3 slow, steady knocks. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Another knock. Then silence. I stayed frozen, waiting, listening. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually, the first light of dawn crept through the windows. I forced myself to stand, my legs stiff. When I finally worked up the courage to open the door, my stomach turned. On the porch, in the same barefoot tracks from the night before, was a single word, carved deep into the wood. Leave. I didn't waste time. I packed my bag, grabbed my keys, and ran for the truck. I didn't care if it didn't start. I had to try. I turned the key. The engine roared to life. I peeled out of there so fast gravel sprayed against the trees. I didn't stop, didn't look back. Not until I was miles away, where my phone finally got service. My hands were shaking as I called Jake. He picked up immediately. "Where the hell are you?" I asked, my voice unsteady. He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "What are you talking about? I never told you to go up there. I got sick yesterday. I figured you'd stay home." I nearly dropped the phone. Someone had sent me those directions. Someone had been waiting for me. I don't know why I agreed to stay in that cabin. Maybe I thought a weekend alone would clear my head. Maybe I just wanted to get away from everything. Work, people, the constant buzz of the city. Whatever the reason, I regret it now. It started with the drive. The road leading up to the cabin was rough, barely more than a dirt path cutting through dense woods. My tires kicked up dust as I followed the directions the owner had given me. No GPS signal, just me, my truck, and miles of trees pressing in on both sides. The sun was setting by the time I pulled up to the cabin. It was small, just a single-story structure with a slanted tin roof. The wood was old and gray, the front porch sagging slightly. It looked abandoned, even though I knew the owner rented it out often. The key was under a loose brick by the door, just like he said it would be. The lock stuck a little, and when I finally shoved the door open, the smell of dust and old wood hit me. The place was bare bones. A couch that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years, a small kitchen with a rust-stained sink, and a single bedroom with a sagging mattress. I dropped my bag on the bed and checked my phone. No service. Not surprising, but it still unsettled me. I told myself I needed to embrace the isolation. That was the whole point, right? Just me, the quiet, and a break from the world. I made dinner, just some canned soup heated on the old gas stove, and ate in silence. Every sound seemed louder in the empty cabin. The creak of the wood, the rustling of the trees outside. When it got dark, it got dark. No streetlights, no distant glow of a town. Just pitch black outside the windows. I could hear the wind moving through the trees, the occasional snap of a branch. I went to bed early, but sleep didn't come easy. The mattress was lumpy, and the blankets smelled musty. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds outside. Something moved in the woods, probably just a deer. Then I heard it, a single, deliberate knock at the front door. My breath caught in my throat. I stayed completely still, listening. Another knock, slow, even. I told myself it was probably a branch or the wind, but I knew better. It was too precise, too intentional. I sat up slowly, my heart hammering. The door had no peephole. I had no way to see who or what was out there. I waited, barely breathing. The knocking didn't come again. After a long time, I forced myself to lie back down. Maybe it had been a branch. Maybe I was just letting my nerves get to me. I must have drifted off at some point because I woke up to something scratching against the cabin wall. A slow, dragging sound, like nails scraping over wood. My stomach twisted. I turned onto my side, staring at the bedroom door, willing myself to stay calm. The scratching moved, starting from one side of the cabin and creeping along the outer wall, stopping just beneath my window. I held my breath, then silence. I don't know how long I lay there, waiting, listening. Eventually, the exhaustion won. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the window. I sat up slowly, every muscle in my body stiff. My mind raced back to the night before. Had I imagined it? I got out of bed and went outside, half expecting to see claw marks or footprints. But there was nothing, just damp leaves and morning mist. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was on edge because I wasn't used to being so isolated. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. The second night was worse. I stayed up late, reading by lantern light. Every so often, I would pause, listening, half expecting to hear the knocking again. For a while, it was quiet. Then, around midnight, I heard it. A soft creaking, like weight shifting on the porch. I held my breath. Then, asterisk tap, tap, tap. Asterisk. Not knocking this time. Tapping. Light, deliberate, against the cabin wall. My skin crawled. I grabbed the flashlight and aimed it at the window, but the glare on the glass showed me nothing but my own reflection. I stood up slowly, trying not to make a sound. I didn't want whoever or whatever was out there to know I was awake. The tapping stopped. I waited, heart pounding. Then I heard footsteps, slow, crunching through the leaves, moving around the cabin. I stayed completely still. A long stretch of silence. Then scraping. The same sound from the night before. dragging along the wall. I clenched my jaw, gripping the flashlight so tight my knuckles turned white. Then it stopped. I waited. Minutes passed. Then I heard my truck door open. I bolted out of bed, yanking the curtain aside just in time to see the door swing shut. But I saw nothing else. No figure, no movement, just the empty truck, parked where I left it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the chair by the door, clutching my flashlight and my hunting knife. I kept telling myself that as soon as the sun came up, I was leaving. Dawn couldn't come fast enough. The moment the sky started turning gray, I grabbed my bag, shoved my things inside, and ran to my truck. The doors were locked, but I knew I had heard them open. I yanked the driver's side open, threw my bag inside, and climbed in. The keys were in my pocket. I started the engine. Then I noticed something in the rearview mirror. The back window of the cabin had fogged up, like someone had been standing inside, breathing against the glass. I didn't stay to check. I threw the truck in reverse, spun it around, and tore down the dirt road faster than was probably safe. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. Even then, I kept looking in the mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the tree line, watching. I never went back, never contacted the owner. I don't even remember where the cabin was exactly, just some forgotten road deep in the woods. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that fogged-up window, and I wonder how long they were watching me. I don't know what made me take the cabin. Maybe I was just tired of the city, the constant noise, the same faces every day. I needed something quiet, somewhere I could clear my head. I thought a few weeks in the mountains would be good for me. I found the place online. It wasn't fancy, just a single-room cabin, no running water, no electricity. The owner didn't ask many questions, just took my deposit and gave me directions. The cabin was way up in the woods, miles from the nearest town. The drive there was long. The road turned from pavement to gravel to dirt. The trees grew thicker, the light dimmed. My cell service cut out. I had downloaded an offline map, but even that struggled to keep up. The cabin wasn't marked on it, just a rough approximation of where it should be. When I finally found it, the place looked off. The pictures online made it seem rustic but cozy. In person, it looked abandoned. The wood was gray, the windows were dusty, the front porch sagged. But I had driven nearly 6 hours, and there was nowhere else to go. Inside, it smelled like damp wood and old dust. There was a fireplace, a cot, a small table, a few chairs. No fridge, no stove, just an old wood-burning stove that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The walls had scratches on them, not deep, but enough to notice. I told myself it was just wear and tear. I unloaded my things, set up my sleeping bag on the cot. I tried to settle in, but something felt off. I shook it off, went outside to collect firewood before dark. The woods were dense, quiet, too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the wind. Felt like something was watching me. I kept glancing over my shoulder. Nothing was there. That first night, I barely slept. The silence was too heavy. Every small sound, branches creaking, wind against the cabin, felt amplified. Around 2 a.m., I heard something. Not the wind, not an animal. It was a soft thudding noise, rhythmic, came from outside. I sat up, heart pounding. It was too dark to see anything outside the window. The noise stopped after a few minutes. I waited, listening. Nothing. I told myself it was a tree branch, tried to go back to sleep. The next day, I hiked. I figured some fresh air, some movement would clear my head. I followed a narrow trail up the mountain, the ground damp under my boots. Half a mile in, I found something odd. A deer carcass, fresh, too fresh. Its stomach was torn open, but there were no flies yet. The cuts were clean, not like an animal had done it. I turned around, headed back. That night, the sound came back, thudding, closer this time. It wasn't a tree branch. It was steady, deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight, crept to the window. Nothing, just darkness and trees. I held my breath, listening. The noise stopped, I stayed by the window for a long time. The next few days, the feeling of being watched got worse. The forest felt wrong. I found more dead animals. Small ones, rabbits, birds. Their bodies were arranged in strange patterns. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. But I started keeping my hatchet by my cot at night. Then, one evening, I found footprints. Human, barefoot, too big to be mine. They were fresh, leading up to my cabin door. But there were no footprints leading away. I locked the door, sat by the fire with my hatchet in my lap. I didn't sleep. 3 a.m., something tapped on the window. Soft, deliberate. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then a whisper. My name. I don't know how long I sat there. The fire burned low. The tapping stopped. The whispering stopped. When the sun came up, I threw my stuff in my bag and left. Didn't even bother packing properly. Just grabbed what I could and ran to my car. The footprints were still there. More of them now. I drove faster than I should have. Didn't look back. Didn't stop until I hit the nearest town. I told the guy at the gas station about the cabin. He just looked at me, asked me where it was. When I told him, he shook his head, said no one should be up there. I didn't ask why. I didn't want to know. I just kept driving. I never went back. It was late October when I decided to spend a weekend alone in my uncle's old hunting cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana. I was 31, and after a long, grueling year, I wanted to get away from everything. No phone, no emails, just quiet. My uncle, Mark, had stopped using the cabin after his knee injury made hunting impossible. So he handed me the keys, along with a warning about how isolated it was. I shrugged it off. That was exactly what I wanted. The drive up was rough. The farther I got from town, the worse the roads became. By the time I hit the last stretch, a narrow dirt path barely wide enough for my truck, I was forced to drive at a crawl to avoid deep potholes. The cabin sat at the bottom of a steep hill, surrounded by thick pines. It was small, just one room with a loft for sleeping, but it had a wood-burning stove, a propane lantern, and enough supplies to last a few days. The first night was peaceful. I chopped some wood, made a fire, and ate a can of chili while listening to the wind push through the trees. Felt good to be away. Around midnight, I climbed into my sleeping bag in the loft and let myself drift off. Then something woke me. I wasn't sure what it was at first. Could have been an animal outside or just the wind shifting the cabin walls. But something felt off. I listened, holding my breath. The woods were silent, too silent. No wind, no creaking branches, no distant hoots from an owl. Just stillness. I told myself I was being paranoid. I turned onto my side and forced my eyes shut. The next morning, I stepped outside and noticed something odd. Fresh footprints in the dirt leading up to the cabin. They were human. The prints were deep, meaning whoever left them was heavy, and they stopped just short of the front door. No tracks leading away. My stomach twisted. Maybe they were old, left behind by hunters, but the rain last night should have washed them away. These were fresh. I checked around the cabin but saw nothing else unusual. The windows were locked. The door was still bolted from the inside. I pushed the thought away. Maybe I made them myself the night before and didn't notice. It was easy to rationalize in the daylight. That night, the silence returned. Around 2 a.m., a noise pulled me from sleep. It was subtle at first, a faint scratching sound, like nails dragging against wood. My chest tightened. I held still, listening. Came from outside, near the back of the cabin. Then, slow, deliberate footsteps circled the building. I sat up, every muscle in my body locked in place. The footsteps stopped just beneath the loft. My heart pounded so loud I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. The sound of breathing, deep, controlled, filtered in through the thin wooden walls. I reached for my hunting knife and held it close, not daring to move. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Eventually, the breathing stopped. The footsteps faded into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. At sunrise, I grabbed my rifle and checked the perimeter. The footprints were back, But this time, they circled the entire cabin over and over. My truck was untouched, but I could see faint marks near the windows where someone, or something, had been standing, looking in. I needed to leave. I packed quickly, shoving everything into my bag. As I loaded my gear into the truck, something caught my eye. A pile of rocks stacked neatly on the hood. 5 stones carefully balanced. A warning. I climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine sputtered but didn't start. I tried again. Nothing. Panic clawed at my chest. I popped the hood and checked the engine. The battery cables had been cut. I was stranded. I grabbed my rifle and sprinted back inside, bolting the door behind me. I forced myself to think. The nearest town was over 20 miles away, and walking through dense woods wasn't an option. I had a radio, but it was old and unreliable. As I paced the room, something hit the front door. A heavy, deliberate knock. I froze. Another knock, harder this time. Then silence. I didn't move. Minutes stretched. The doorknob rattled. I gripped my rifle and aimed at the door, my finger hovering over the trigger. The rattling stopped. Then the sound of footsteps, moving away, slowly disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. The knocking didn't return, but I knew whoever was out there was still watching, waiting. At first light, I gathered what little I could carry and started walking. I followed the dirt road, my rifle clutched in both hands. I moved fast, heart pounding with every step. 2 hours passed before I heard the sound of an engine in the distance. Relief flooded through me as a truck appeared, an older man behind the wheel. He saw me, slowed down, and rolled down the window. "You all right?" he asked, eyeing the rifle in my hands. I swallowed hard. "Truck broke down. I need a ride to town." He nodded. "Get in." I climbed into the cab, glancing back toward the trees one last time. The man said nothing as he drove. After a few minutes, he finally spoke. "You were in that old cabin, weren't you?" I hesitated. "Yeah," he sighed, shaking his head. "Shouldn't be out there alone." I didn't ask why. I already knew. I never went back to that cabin. My uncle sold the land a few months later, and I didn't argue. I still don't know who or what was out there that night. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I swear I can still hear the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps circling my house. I don't know why I agreed to go out there. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself. Maybe I was just being stubborn. But I wish I never set foot in that cabin. It was October of 2017. I was 31 years old, living alone in an apartment outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. I worked a job I didn't care about, spent most of my free time watching TV, and had fallen out of touch with most of my friends. One day, my uncle called and said he needed a favor. His name was John, my dad's older brother. He owned a small hunting cabin deep in the woods, a little over 2 hours outside the city. Said he had some work to do out of state, but didn't want to leave the place empty for too long. There had been reports of squatters in the area, and he wanted someone to check in on it every couple of days. I guess he thought I could use a break from my dull routine. I wasn't exactly thrilled about the idea, but he offered to pay me, and I wasn't in a position to turn down extra cash. He gave me a set of keys, told me there was enough food in the cabin to last a couple of weeks, and said I could leave whenever I wanted. That was the deal. Just stay there, make sure no one messed with the place, and keep an eye out for anything unusual. I packed up some clothes and drove out on a Wednesday afternoon. The further I got from the city, the more I regretted saying yes. The road leading to the cabin was nothing more than a narrow dirt path, twisting through dense trees. It felt like I was driving straight into a place no one was supposed to be. By the time I pulled up in front of the cabin, the sun was starting to set. The place was small, just a single room with a kitchen area, a cot, and an old wood stove. A small shed sat about 30 yards behind it, and a rusted water pump stood just outside the front door. There was no cell service, just me, the trees, and the wind. The first night was uneventful. I built a fire in the stove, made a can of soup, and read an old book I found on a shelf. The silence was thick. I could hear every crack of the fire, every rustle of the wind through the trees. It was peaceful in a way, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there. The second night, things got strange. I had spent the day chopping wood, making sure I had enough to last through the cold nights. As I sat by the stove eating dinner, I heard something outside. A quick, snapping sound, like a branch breaking. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The woods were still. No wind, no movement. Just the towering trees and the heavy dark pressing in from all sides. I swept the flashlight across the yard. Nothing. I told myself it was just an animal and went back inside, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. Around midnight, I woke up to another sound. This time it was different, closer, a soft, shuffling noise, like something moving through the leaves just outside the cabin. My heart pounded as I lay still, listening. The sound moved from one side of the cabin to the other, slow and deliberate. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't some random animal. It was something else, someone else. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, but the sound didn't stop. I grabbed my uncle's rifle from where it leaned against the wall and crept toward the window. I barely breathed as I peeked outside. Nothing, just darkness and trees. But then I saw it, just for a second. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the weak moonlight. I couldn't make out any details, just the shape of a person. Watching, my stomach dropped. My hands went cold. I stood frozen, gripping the rifle, waiting for something to happen. But after a few seconds, the figure just stepped back into the trees. Gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I checked the area around the cabin. There were footprints in the dirt. Bare footprints, too large to be a child's, too small to be my uncle's. They led from the woods to the side of the cabin, stopping just below the window where I had been sleeping. I wanted to leave. Every instinct screamed at me to get in my truck and drive as far away as possible. But I told myself it was just some drifter passing through. Maybe a hunter who got lost. Maybe someone messing with me. I stayed. The next few nights, I barely slept. Every little sound made my skin crawl. I kept the rifle next to me, my back against the wall, my ears straining in the silence. Nothing happened. No more footprints, no more figures in the trees. Just the endless quiet of the woods. Then, on the fifth night, I woke up to a sound that made my blood run cold. Breathing, not mine. It was slow, steady, coming from just outside the thin wooden walls. Deep, deliberate inhales like someone standing just inches away, taking their time. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just sat there in the darkness, listening. The breathing continued for what felt like hours. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I didn't wait for morning. I grabbed my bag, threw open the door, and ran to my truck. The engine roared to life, and I tore down the dirt road, my hands shaking. I didn't look back. When I got back to the city, I called my uncle and told him everything. He barely reacted, just said he'd had a few weird experiences out there too. Told me I did the right thing leaving. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never go back. It was the middle of October when I finally decided to take the trip. I needed time alone, away from work, away from people. My uncle had a cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana. He rarely used it anymore, and when I mentioned needing a break, he tossed me the keys and told me to enjoy it. The drive was long, nearly 6 hours from my apartment in Missoula. The last 2 hours were on a winding dirt road, nothing but trees stretching for miles. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No passing cars, no cell service. Just the crunch of gravel under my tires and the occasional rustling of wind through the trees. The cabin itself was small but sturdy. It had been in my family for years, passed down from my grandfather. A single-story wooden structure with a slanted roof, a wraparound porch, and a brick chimney. There was no electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, an old well, and a lantern for light. I parked my truck and stepped out. The air was sharp and cold. The smell of pine and damp earth filled my nose. The forest pressed in from all sides, thick and dark. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. Inside, the cabin was simple. A single bed pushed against the far wall, a small table and 2 chairs, and shelves lined with dusty canned goods. The wood stove sat in the corner, an old iron beast covered in soot. There was a locked storage room in the back. I didn't have the key, and my uncle never mentioned what was inside. I spent the first evening getting settled. Chopped some wood, made a fire, cooked a can of beans on the stove. The silence was almost unsettling at first, but I grew used to it. The isolation was nice. The first night, I slept deeply. The bed was stiff, the blankets musty, but I was exhausted. Sometime in the early morning, I woke up to a sound outside, a soft, shuffling noise, like something moving through the leaves. I sat up, heart pounding, listening. Then silence. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon digging through old scraps. But I still locked the door before going back to sleep. The next day, I explored the area. My uncle had mentioned an old trail behind the cabin that led to a creek. It was overgrown, barely visible, but I followed it. The forest was dense, the trees towering overhead, blocking out most of the sunlight. The deeper I went, the more uneasy I felt. After nearly 20 minutes, I reached the creek. The water was cold and clear, flowing lazily over smooth stones. I crouched down, splashing some on my face. That's when I saw them. Footprints, fresh ones in the damp soil by the water. Barefoot, human. A chill ran down my spine. I stood up quickly, scanning the trees. Nothing, just the sound of the water and the rustling of leaves in the wind. I tried to shake it off. Maybe someone had been out here earlier in the day. Maybe a hiker. But the prints were deep, well-defined. Not old. I walked back to the cabin faster than I had come. That night, I sat by the fire with a book. The lantern cast long shadows on the walls. Every so often, I glanced at the window, half expecting to see someone standing there. Nothing. Eventually, I crawled into bed, pulling the blankets up tight. The woods were silent, too silent. Then, just as I started drifting off, I heard it again, that same shuffling noise, closer this time, right outside the cabin. I held my breath. The fire was still burning, casting a faint orange glow across the room. My hunting knife was on the table, just a few feet away. Slowly, carefully, I reached for it. The sound stopped. I sat there, knife in hand, heart hammering. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my nerves. The woods played tricks on people. The silence, the isolation, it could make you hear things that weren't there. The third day, I decided to check around the cabin. In the daylight, everything felt normal again. But then I found something that made my blood run cold. More footprints. This time, they were right outside the cabin, leading from the treeline to my porch. I crouched down, examining them, barefoot again. And there was something else. Drag marks beside them, as if something heavy had been pulled through the dirt. I stood up, scanning the trees. My skin prickled. Someone had been here, watching me. I packed my things immediately, tossed everything into the truck, and got the hell out. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I drove until I reached the main road, until I had service again, until the cabin was nothing but a bad memory. When I told my uncle, he just nodded, said he hadn't been up there in years. Said there used to be an old hermit who lived in those woods, decades ago. A man who had disappeared without a trace. Maybe it was just a story, maybe not. All I know is that I'll never go back. I don't know why I said yes. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself, or maybe I just didn't want to seem scared. Either way, I agreed to go, and now I regret it. It started with an invitation from an old coworker, Dan. We hadn't talked much since he left the company a few years ago, but out of nowhere, he messaged me about a weekend trip. He and a couple of guys had rented a cabin up north. Just a way to get off the grid for a while, he said. I wasn't close to any of them, but something in me said yes before I could really think it through. The drive took longer than expected. We left late in the afternoon, and by the time we got close, the sun was already setting. The road leading to the cabin wasn't even really a road, just a dirt path barely wide enough for Dan's truck. The trees pressed in from both sides, and the deeper we went, the more it felt like we were leaving the world behind. The cabin itself was old. Not in a charming, rustic way, just old. The wood was dark and warped, the windows were cloudy, and the front porch sagged like it was tired of standing. It was bigger than I expected, though. 2 floors, a loft, and a basement. Dan said the guy who rented it out used to live there full-time until one winter, he just stopped showing up in town. No one really knew what happened to him, but eventually the place went up for rent. Inside, the air was stale, like it hadn't been opened up in years. Dust covered everything. There was no electricity, just a wood stove and a few old gas lamps scattered around. The furniture was simple, mostly handmade wooden chairs and a heavy table in the center of the main room. The stairs to the second floor looked like they would break if you stepped too hard. We settled in as best we could. The first night was uneventful, mostly just drinking and playing cards by lantern light. I kept getting this weird feeling, though, like we weren't alone. Not in a ghostly way, but like we were being watched. The windows were too dark to see out of, just black rectangles reflecting the flickering lanterns. Every now and then, I swore I heard something outside, but every time I mentioned it, the guys laughed it off. The second day, we explored a bit. There was a trail leading away from the cabin, so we followed it. The deeper we went, the more overgrown it got, like no one had walked it in years. About a mile in, we found something strange. A rusted-out truck, half buried in the undergrowth. It looked like it had been there for decades. The doors were gone, the tires had rotted away, and vines twisted through the engine. We checked inside but didn't find much. Just an old hunting knife and some scattered papers too damaged to read. That night, things started to feel off. The woods were silent, too silent. No wind, no animals, just this heavy stillness. Around midnight, I heard something move outside. Not the snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves, but something heavy. I sat up in my sleeping bag, listening. Then a thud, like something hitting the side of the cabin. I waited, heart pounding. Another thud, closer to the window. I reached for my flashlight, but just as I turned it on, it went dead. The batteries had been fine earlier. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal, just a black screen reflecting my own face back at me. I barely slept. Every noise made me jump. The guys were all out cold, snoring away like nothing was wrong. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear or a deer, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I checked outside. Nothing was out of place, but the air felt wrong, charged with something I couldn't name. Dan joked that I looked like I'd seen a ghost. I didn't laugh. We decided to leave that evening instead of staying another night. Something about the place just felt bad. As we packed up, I went to grab some firewood from the shed out back. The door was stuck, swollen shut from the weather. When I finally forced it open, I stopped cold. Inside, the walls were covered in scratches. Deep, jagged marks gouged into the wood, some overlapping, some stretching from the floor to the ceiling. In the far corner, there was a pile of bones. Not big ones, small like from rabbits or squirrels, but there were too many, and they were fresh. I backed away slowly, my breath coming fast. I ran back inside and told the guys we needed to go now. No one argued. The drive back was dead silent. No one spoke, no one joked. We just drove. When we finally hit paved roads, I felt like I could breathe again. I don't know what was out there. Maybe nothing. Maybe just my imagination. But I know one thing for sure. I'll never go back. I never planned on spending the weekend alone at the cabin. It wasn't some romanticized getaway, no deep reason behind it. My brother and I had planned a hunting trip, but he backed out last minute. I had the time off work, the truck was packed, and I figured, why waste it? I told myself it'd be peaceful. A quiet couple of days in the woods, away from people, noise, and the same daily routine. The cabin wasn't fancy. It belonged to an old friend of my dad's, and he let us use it when we wanted. Small, one bedroom with a tiny kitchen and a living space barely big enough to hold the old couch and coffee table. No TV, no Wi-Fi. The bathroom was just a wooden outhouse a few steps into the trees. A place meant for people comfortable with solitude. I'd been there before, but never alone. The drive out took about 4 hours, most of it on empty 2-lane highways. Then came the dirt road, which was little more than 2 tire tracks through the trees, winding deeper and deeper into nowhere. The further I got, the more I realized just how alone I'd be. No cell service, no help if I needed it. That was fine. I was used to the outdoors, knew how to handle myself. I got to the cabin in the late afternoon. The woods were quiet, just the distant sound of birds and the occasional rustling of trees in the breeze. The place looked the same as always. Weathered wood, a slanted roof, a front porch with 2 old chairs that creaked in the wind. The key was right where it always was, under the loose rock beside the door. Inside, the air was stale, like it had been shut up for too long. I opened the single window in the living area, let in some fresh air while I set my stuff down, unpacked the cooler, put some bottled water on the counter, and set my rifle against the wall. I wasn't planning to hunt until the next morning, so I spent the rest of the afternoon gathering some firewood, checking around the cabin to make sure everything was in working order. The place had been fine the last time I was here, but it never hurt to double check. As the sun started setting, I made a small fire outside, cooked a couple of hot dogs on sticks. I sat there, listening to the sounds of the forest, watching the fire crackle. There was something peaceful about it, the deep kind of quiet you don't get anywhere else. When it got too dark to see past the tree line, I decided to head inside. The inside of the cabin was different at night. Not that it changed, nothing had moved, nothing was out of place, but the feeling was different. Maybe it was the way the darkness pressed against the windows, the way the oil lamp cast flickering shadows against the walls. I locked the door out of habit, made sure the rifle was close by, then settled onto the couch with a book. I don't remember falling asleep. I just remember waking up to a sound outside. First, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching against the dry leaves just beyond the porch. My first thought was a deer. They wandered close sometimes, but something about the sound made my stomach knot. I sat up, listening. The footsteps stopped. The woods were silent. I reached for my rifle, stood up carefully. The floor creaked under my feet. I moved toward the window, keeping to the side so I wouldn't be seen. The fire outside had burned down to glowing embers, casting just enough light to see the porch. Empty. I stayed there for a long time, staring out into the trees. Nothing moved. No sound. After a while, I convinced myself I imagined it. That maybe I had still been half asleep, and the noise was just my brain playing tricks on me. I locked the window, checked the door again, went back to the couch, setting my rifle next to me this time. I don't know how long I was asleep before it happened again. A single thud against the porch, like something heavy had just been dropped there. I sat up so fast my head spun. My hand went straight to the rifle, my pulse hammering in my ears. Silence. I strained to hear anything over the pounding in my chest. Then another sound, something light, almost a shuffle, moving just beyond the door. My first thought was an animal. A bear, maybe, though they usually stayed away from people. Then, clear as day, I heard the floorboards creak. Someone was on the porch. My stomach twisted into a knot. I gripped the rifle tighter, trying to think. Could have been a hunter, lost, maybe looking for help. But why wouldn't they call out? Why wouldn't they knock? Another creak. Closer this time. I stood, moving slowly toward the door. I was careful with each step, keeping my breathing steady. The lamp on the table flickered. The whole cabin felt too small, too exposed. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. I waited, listening. My grip on the rifle was so tight my fingers ached. Nothing. I waited longer. Still nothing. Finally, I forced myself to move. I reached for the door handle, hesitated, then unlocked it as quietly as I could. The hinges groaned as I eased it open, just enough to see outside. The porch was empty. The woods beyond were just as still as before. The fire pit was nothing but cold embers. The only thing that seemed out of place was a single footprint in the dirt near the steps. A boot print, larger than mine. I stepped back inside, locked the door, and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By morning, nothing had changed. No more noises, no signs of anything being disturbed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there, watching, waiting. I packed up my things, loaded my truck in record time. Before I left, I walked back onto the porch, scanning the tree line one last time. There was nothing there, but as I turned to go, I noticed something on the railing. A single deep scratch carved into the wood, fresh, clean, like someone had dragged a knife across it. I never went back to that cabin. I never wanted to go to that cabin. It was the middle of November 2013. My brother, Ryan, had just gotten out of a bad breakup, and he wanted to get away for a bit. He asked if I wanted to come with him to a cabin he had rented up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan for a few days. Just the two of us, some hiking, some fishing, clear our heads. I didn't need my head cleared, but I also didn't want Ryan to go alone. He wasn't in a good place, and I figured spending a few days out in the quiet might be good for him. The drive up was long. We left Indianapolis early in the morning, and the further north we got, the colder it became. The sky was that dull, featureless gray that makes everything feel lifeless. The trees were mostly bare, and the ones that still had leaves were shriveled and dead-looking. By the time we crossed into Michigan, a fine layer of frost covered everything, and the roads were empty. The cabin itself was about 30 miles outside of Marquette, deep in the woods. No cell service, no internet. Just a small, one-story place with a wraparound porch and a wood-burning stove. It looked old but solid, with thick logs for walls and a steep roof to keep the snow from piling up. There was a lake nearby, completely still, and an old fire pit in the yard. Inside, it was small but comfortable. A main living area with a couch, a couple of chairs, a fireplace, and a little kitchen off to the side. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom. The furniture looked like it had been there forever, heavy wood, thick cushions, kind of musty. The place smelled like pine and old smoke. The first night was fine. We built a fire, made some canned chili, and had a few beers. It was quiet out there, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. I wasn't used to it. Even in my apartment back home, there was always some background noise, cars outside, the hum of the fridge. Here there was nothing, just the occasional creak of the cabin settling or the wind moving through the trees. I woke up in the middle of the night feeling weird. I wasn't sure why at first. It wasn't a noise that woke me up, more like a feeling, like something was off. The room was pitch black, and for a second, I wasn't sure where I was. I reached for my phone, but then I remembered no service. I listened for a while, but I didn't hear anything, just the wind. I rolled over and tried to go back to sleep, but I had that nagging feeling like something wasn't right. It took me a long time to drift off again. The next morning, Ryan was already up, making coffee. He looked rough, dark circles under his eyes, unshaven. He said he hadn't slept well either. Kept feeling like I was hearing something outside, he said. I asked him what kind of something, but he just shrugged. I dunno. Just something. We spent most of the day hiking around the woods. It was colder than I expected, and the ground was hard with frost. The trees were tall and close together, and I kept feeling like we were being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see an animal or maybe another person, but there was never anything there. Around midday, we found an old, rusted-out truck in the middle of the woods. No roads anywhere nearby, just sitting there, half buried in the undergrowth. The doors were gone, and the inside was stripped. I had no idea how it even got there. It looked like it had been there for decades. Ryan thought it was cool. I thought it was creepy. We walked a little further and found an old cabin, smaller than the one we were staying in, maybe just a one-room shack. The door was hanging off the hinges, and the inside was dark and rotting. There was an old bed frame in one corner, rusted springs poking through. A table with one leg broken. Something that might have been a wood stove, but it was so corroded it was hard to tell. It stank inside, like something had been living there or maybe died there. "I don't like this place," I said. Ryan just laughed. "It's just an old hunting shack," he said. "Nothing to worry about." But I was worried. The whole place gave me a bad feeling, like we shouldn't be there. That night, I woke up again. This time, I knew why. There was a sound outside. A slow, deliberate crunching of footsteps on the frozen ground. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard a creak, the sound of wood shifting, like someone stepping onto the porch. I sat up slowly, heart pounding. My hands were ice cold. Then silence. Nothing for a long time. I waited, barely breathing. I wanted to wake Ryan up, but I was afraid to move. Then the sound of the porch steps creaking again, going down this time. Then footsteps moving away, back into the woods. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, I checked the porch. There were footprints in the frost, leading up to the cabin, then back into the trees. Human footprints, barefoot. Ryan and I packed up and left that day. We never talked about it again. I don't believe in ghosts. I never have. But fear doesn't always come from the supernatural. It can come from something real, something living, something watching. It was late November, just before the first heavy snow of the season. My brother, Sam, had just come back from deployment, and we wanted to get away for a few days. He had always been the outdoorsy type, and after spending the last year overseas, he craved fresh air, the sound of trees moving in the wind, and the quiet of being away from people. He found a cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. It was an old rental, cheap, nothing fancy, just enough to sleep and keep warm. The owner told us it had been empty for years, except for the occasional hunter passing through. It had no internet, no television, just a wood-burning stove, a couple of lanterns, and a small generator that powered the bare essentials. The first night was fine, cold but fine. We unpacked our things, got the fire going, and had a few beers while talking about nothing important. The isolation was nice. The only sound was the occasional gust of wind through the trees. The forest outside was thick, dark, untouched. It was the second night that things changed. I woke up sometime after midnight. The cabin was silent except for the faint sound of Sam snoring in the other room. The fire had burned down to a few glowing embers, and I could see my breath in the air. I grabbed another log and tossed it onto the coals, watching as it slowly caught. Then I heard it, a noise outside, just past the tree line. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer moving through the brush. But it wasn't that. It was slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps on dried leaves. I stood there, listening, my skin tight with goosebumps. Another step, closer this time. I turned off the lantern and moved to the window. The forest was black, nothing but shadows between the trees. I stayed there for a long time, staring, barely breathing. Then the sound stopped. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a branch breaking under its own weight. Maybe the wind shifting the trees. I forced myself back into bed, listening until I fell asleep. The next morning, I walked outside, my boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. Sam was already up, splitting firewood. I walked around the cabin, just to settle my nerves. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Not animal prints. Not boot prints. Bare footprints, large, wide like a man's. But they weren't fresh. The edges were softened by the cold, like they'd been there overnight. I told myself it was a trick of the frost, but I knew better. I didn't tell Sam. He had been through enough. War, violence, things I couldn't imagine. He came here to get away from all that. I didn't want to be the one to bring fear into our little getaway. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing things. A branch breaking, leaves shifting, the occasional creak of old wood settling. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling, waiting, listening. Then, around 3 in the morning, I heard it again. A slow, deliberate step. Then another, right outside the cabin. I felt sick. My body was rigid, every muscle locked. My breath slowed, my pulse hammering in my throat. Then, something touched the doorknob. I heard it rattle gently, like someone testing the lock. I held my breath. I didn't move. Then silence. I don't know how long I lay there before exhaustion finally pulled me under. The next morning, I told Sam. He laughed at first, said I was overthinking it. But when he saw the footprints, his face changed. He wasn't laughing anymore. We packed our things and left. Fast. We didn't talk much on the drive back to town. Every few miles, Sam checked the rearview mirror, and I found myself glancing out the window, half expecting to see something standing at the tree line, watching us leave. I don't know who or what was out there. Maybe just some drifter, living off the land, curious about our presence. Maybe someone who had lived in that cabin before and didn't like seeing it occupied. Or maybe someone who never left. All I know is this. The next time I go to the woods, I'll make sure I'm not alone. And I'll make damn sure I bring a gun. I was never the kind of person to get spooked easily. I didn't believe in ghosts or any of that supernatural nonsense, but I did believe in people. And people, when put in the right or wrong circumstances, were capable of things far worse than anything a ghost could do. It started with an ad. A simple listing on some outdated website I can't even remember the name of now. Remote cabin for rent, perfect for solitude. That's all it said, with a couple of grainy photos showing a small wooden structure surrounded by dense trees. It wasn't much to look at, but it was exactly what I needed. I had just gone through a breakup, and life in the city was starting to feel like a pressure cooker. I wanted space, air, and silence. The cabin was up north, about a 5-hour drive from where I lived. The owner, some guy named Tom, was practically giving it away for the month. No deposit, no paperwork, just cash up front. That should have been my first red flag, but I was too eager to get away to care. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun already dipping behind the thick forest that surrounded the place. The last 20 miles were all dirt roads, winding through towering trees that swallowed the daylight and made everything feel eerily enclosed. I was relieved when I finally pulled up to the cabin. It was small but sturdy looking. A single-story structure with a slanted tin roof, weathered wooden walls, and a porch with a couple of rocking chairs. A wood pile was stacked neatly to the side, and an old axe rested against it. The front door had a simple latch, no deadbolt. That should have been another red flag. Inside, it was basic but clean. A small kitchen with an old stove, a fridge that hummed loudly, and a sink with a single tap. There was a wooden table with 2 chairs, a couch that had definitely seen better days, and a fireplace filled with ash. The bedroom was just big enough for a full-sized bed and a rickety dresser. A single window looked out into the trees. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I liked it immediately. The first couple of days were exactly what I needed. I woke up early, made coffee on the stove, and spent my time reading or hiking the trails that wove through the forest. I felt better out there, breathing in the crisp air, my mind finally quieting. But then, small things started happening. The first was the footsteps. The cabin's porch had loose boards, and I noticed on my second night that they creaked when I stepped on them. That night, as I was lying in bed, I heard them creak again. It was slow and deliberate, like someone testing their weight on each board. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, straining to hear past the silence. But after a minute, it stopped. I told myself it was an animal, a raccoon or maybe a deer brushing up against the cabin. But then, the next morning, I found something. The latch on the front door was unhooked. I knew for a fact I had latched it before bed. I checked it twice. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that maybe the wood had swollen from the cold and caused the latch to slip. But I felt uneasy in a way I couldn't shake. That night, I locked the door and propped a chair against it. If the latch came undone again, I'd hear it. I barely slept, my ears straining for any sound. I heard nothing, but when I checked the door in the morning, the latch was unhooked again, and the chair had moved slightly. That's when I decided to search the property. I grabbed the axe from the woodpile and started walking around the cabin, looking for footprints, anything that might explain what was happening. The ground was hard, and I didn't see much, but then, about 10 feet from the back of the cabin, I found something that made my stomach drop. a cigarette butt, freshly smoked. Someone had been standing there, close enough to see inside the cabin. I tried to tell myself it could have been left there before I arrived, but deep down, I knew better. I wasn't alone out there. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept the axe next to my bed, listening for any sound. The wind howled through the trees, and every creak of the cabin made my pulse spike. Then, at some point past midnight, I heard it again. The porch creaking. Slow, deliberate steps. I held my breath, gripping the axe so hard my hands hurt. The steps stopped right outside the door. Then, silence. The longest silence I've ever experienced in my life. Then, the door handle jiggled. Hard. I jumped out of bed, heart hammering, and shouted, "Who's there?" Silence. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just waited. Then, slowly, the footsteps retreated. I waited until the sun started creeping through the trees before I finally dared to move. When I opened the door, I found something new, a single boot print in the dirt. I packed my things and left immediately. I drove until I hit the nearest town, my hands shaking the entire way. I found a motel, checked in, and locked myself inside. The next day, I called Tom, the owner of the cabin, from a payphone. "You left early," he said. "Yeah," I said. "Someone was out there. Someone was trying to get in." There was a pause. Then he sighed. "You weren't the first," he said. I hung up without another word. I never went back, never found out who it was or what they wanted. But to this day, I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't woken up that night. I don't go looking for solitude anymore. It was late October when I finally got the chance to take a break from work and get away for a bit. I had been dealing with too much long hours, stress piling up, and the feeling that something was constantly pressing down on me. A weekend alone in a cabin sounded perfect. I wasn't looking for luxury, just quiet. Somewhere off the beaten path where I wouldn't have to deal with people or noise. I found a listing online for a small cabin out in the woods of northern Minnesota. It wasn't part of some fancy resort or tourist attraction. Just a simple place owned by an old couple who rented it out here and there. The pictures showed a small, one-room structure with a wood-burning stove, a cot, a table, and a single window looking out into the dense trees. No Wi-Fi, barely any phone service. Exactly what I needed. The drive up was peaceful at first. Long stretches of empty road, golden leaves falling in the crisp air. But the further I went, the more uneasy I started to feel. The road turned from pavement to dirt, narrowing as trees pressed in closer on both sides. I had to check my phone a few times to make sure I hadn't taken a wrong turn, but the GPS still showed I was on track. I reached the cabin just before sunset. It looked exactly like the photos, maybe a little more rundown, but that didn't bother me. I grabbed my bag, locked the car, and stepped inside. It smelled like old wood and dust, a little musty but nothing unbearable. The place was basic. A single cot against the wall, a wood stove in the corner, and a small table with a couple of chairs. There was no running water, just a jug and a basin for washing up, and an outhouse a short walk away. The only light came from an old oil lamp and a small flashlight I had brought. I set my bag down and got to work. First thing was starting a fire in the stove. It was already getting cold. The firewood was stacked neatly against the wall, and after a few tries, I got it going. The warmth helped ease some of the tension I hadn't even realized I was holding. I ate a quick dinner, some sandwiches I had packed, then decided to sit outside for a bit before it got too dark. The woods were silent, too silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant sounds of animals moving through the underbrush, just stillness. I told myself it was fine. This deep in the woods, maybe there just weren't many animals around. But it still felt wrong, like something was off. I stayed out for a little while longer, but the quiet got to me. I went inside, locked the door, and settled in for the night. At some point, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was awake and staring at the ceiling. Something had pulled me out of sleep, but I didn't know what. I lay there listening, but the silence was the same as before. No wind, no creaking trees, just my own breathing and the faint crackle of the fire. Then there was a sound, a faint shuffling noise outside. It wasn't the wind. It was something moving, slow, deliberate steps on the dry leaves. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound stopped. I waited, my heart pounding. Maybe it was just an animal, a deer, a raccoon, something harmless. But the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, landing on the window. The glass was old, slightly warped, making it hard to see outside clearly. I stood up slowly, careful not to make noise, and moved toward the window. Nothing, just darkness. The trees stood still, their branches motionless. I turned away, telling myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I had imagined the noise. Maybe it was just the house settling. I climbed back into the cot, but sleep didn't come easy. I lay there for hours, listening. Sometime in the early morning, I must have fallen asleep again because I woke to the sound of something tapping against the cabin wall. A light, rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming their fingers against the wood. My whole body went cold. I sat up slowly, barely breathing. The sound continued, tap, tap, tap. Then it stopped. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, feeling my legs shake. I had to look. I had to know. I stepped toward the door, hesitated, then unlocked it as quietly as I could. The moment I pulled it open, the cold air rushed in. I shone the light outside, sweeping the beam across the clearing. Nothing, but the leaves in front of the cabin were disturbed, like something or someone had been standing there, watching, listening. I slammed the door shut and locked it. There was no way I was imagining this. Something had been out there. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I packed my things in a hurry. I wasn't staying another night. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. That's when I saw them. Footprints, leading from the tree line to my cabin door. Human footprints, bare feet. I didn't stop to think. I threw my bag into the car, started the engine, and tore down the dirt road, barely looking back. I never found out who or what was out there that night. I didn't call the owners, didn't check the news. I just wanted to forget, but I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see those footprints. I hear the tapping, and I know deep down that whatever was out there is still there, watching, waiting. I don't know why I agreed to stay at the cabin. Maybe it was the way Mike made it sound, like some quiet escape in the woods, just a weekend away from everything. Work had been eating me alive, and I guess I thought a little solitude would help. Just me, the trees, the cold mountain air. No distractions. The drive up was fine at first. The road twisted through thick pine forests, and the higher I climbed, the thinner the air felt. It was early November, and the weather was unpredictable. Clouds heavy with the threat of snow, the kind of silence that presses down on everything. The last town I passed through was small, just a gas station and a diner with flickering neon lights. After that, it was just me and the road. The cabin itself was old, but not in a charming way. More like something left behind. A single-story structure with faded wood siding and a sagging porch. The kind of place that hadn't seen company in a long time. Mike had given me directions over the phone, said the key would be under the mat. And it was. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and inside, the air smelled stale, like dust and old wood. The layout was simple. One main room with a small kitchen off to the side, a narrow hallway leading to the bedroom and bathroom. A wood-burning stove stood against the far wall, and a stack of firewood sat in the corner. I walked through the cabin, checking the bedroom. A single bed with a sagging mattress, an old wooden dresser, a window that looked out into the trees. The first night I settled in, lit the stove, heated up some canned soup, and read by the dim lantern light. The wind picked up outside, making the trees sway and groan. I told myself I was comfortable, that this was what I needed. But that night, something woke me up. A sound, not loud, just enough to pull me from sleep. A soft scrape, like something dragging across the wooden porch. I lay there, holding my breath, listening. The wind outside had died down. Everything was still. I sat up slowly, my heart thudding against my ribs, reached for the flashlight beside the bed and clicked it on. The room was empty, just as I had left it. I got out of bed, moving quietly through the cabin, checking the front door. Locked. I pressed my ear against it, listening. Nothing. I shook it off. Just the wind, I told myself. Maybe a tree branch scraping against the porch. The next day, I hiked. The trails behind the cabin were overgrown but still passable. I moved through the trees, trying to clear my head. The air was crisp, my breath fogging in front of me. I walked for hours, following the trails deeper into the woods. That's when I noticed it. The silence. No birds, no rustling leaves, just my footsteps crunching against the frost-covered ground. I stopped, listening, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, like the woods were holding their breath. A feeling crept up my spine, something instinctual. I turned back, walking faster now, keeping my eyes on the path ahead. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was setting. I locked the door behind me, trying to shake the unease. Told myself I was just imagining things. That night, I woke up again. The sound was closer, a slow, deliberate creak of wood, like weight shifting on the porch. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight. The clock beside the bed read 3:12 a.m. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, standing as quietly as I could. Moved toward the window, careful not to make a sound. I peeled back the curtain just enough to see outside. Nothing, just darkness, the faint outline of trees. I exhaled, letting go of the tension in my chest. Then I saw it, just at the edge of the trees, a figure, standing still, watching. I jerked back from the window, my pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't move for a long time, just stood there, gripping the flashlight, breathing hard. When I finally worked up the nerve to look again, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep after that, just sat in the chair by the stove, listening. By morning, I was packed. I wasn't staying another night. I stepped outside, scanning the tree line. Nothing. I locked the cabin behind me and got in the truck, my hands still shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled away, I saw them, footprints, leading from the trees to the porch, and none leading back. It was early November when I arrived at the cabin. I had rented it online, planning to spend a week alone in the mountains of Montana. The idea was to take a break from everything, my job, my phone, the city noise. Just me, a stack of books, some canned food, and the quiet of the woods. The cabin was old, but not in the charming way I had hoped. It was small, with dark wooden walls that had clearly been patched up over the years. The front porch sagged a little, and the windows were streaked with years of weather damage. Inside, it smelled of dust and old wood, with a faint, damp undertone, like it had been left closed up too long. There was no electricity, just a gas stove, a fireplace, and a single oil lamp on the table. The first night, I settled in easily enough. The silence was thick, almost overwhelming, but I welcomed it. I made a simple dinner, read by lantern light, and went to bed early. The bed was stiff, the blanket scratchy, but I was tired from the long drive and the cold mountain air made it easy to sleep. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound. It wasn't loud, just a faint scratching coming from somewhere outside. At first, I thought it might be tree branches against the cabin, but when I listened closely, it seemed deliberate. The sound came and went in slow, uneven intervals. Scratch, pause, scratch, scratch, pause. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. The sound stopped. Telling myself it was just a raccoon or some other animal, I forced myself to lie back down. Sleep came in restless patches, and by morning, I convinced myself I had imagined it. The second night, I woke up again, this time to a different noise, footsteps. Not heavy, but clear enough that they weren't from an animal. They circled the cabin, slow and deliberate. I stayed completely still in bed, listening as the steps moved from one side of the cabin to the other. I didn't move, didn't breathe, Then silence. I waited, straining my ears for any more sounds. Minutes passed. Nothing. Slowly, I got up and moved to the window, careful not to make a sound. The night outside was pitch black. The moon barely lit the clearing in front of the cabin, and the trees cast long, twisted shadows. I couldn't see anyone. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I checked around the cabin for footprints, but the ground was too hard, covered in layers of fallen pine needles. Still, I felt uneasy. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. The nearest town was nearly an hour away, and there were no other cabins nearby. By the third night, I was on edge. I kept the oil lamp burning low and sat up in bed, listening. The night was quiet at first, the kind of quiet that almost hums in your ears. Then, just past 2 a.m., the scratching started again. This time, it was at the back of the cabin, right outside my bedroom wall. Long, slow scratches moving from one side of the wall to the other. Then came the footsteps. They started at the front of the cabin and moved around the side. Slow, careful, deliberate. I sat completely still, gripping the blanket in my fists. My breathing was shallow, my chest tight. The steps reached the back of the cabin and stopped. Then, nothing. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, waiting. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke up to the weak morning light streaming through the window. That day, I debated leaving, but I had driven hours to get here, and I had already paid for the cabin. Besides, I hadn't actually seen anything. It was probably just my imagination running wild. That's what I told myself. The fourth night, I decided to stay awake. I kept the oil lamp burning and sat in the chair by the window, watching the darkness outside. I had my hunting knife on the table beside me. It was just after 2 a.m. when I heard it again. First, the scratching, then the footsteps. This time, I didn't freeze. I stood up, gripping the knife in one hand, and moved quietly toward the window. The steps were slow, moving around the cabin just like before. I pressed myself against the wall, staying out of sight. My pulse hammered in my ears. The steps reached the back of the cabin, and then, for the first time, I heard something new. A soft, shuddering breath, right outside the wall. My stomach turned to ice. I stayed there, barely breathing, listening. The breathing was slow, controlled, like someone trying to be quiet. Then, after what felt like an eternity, it stopped. The steps moved away. I stayed awake until dawn. As soon as the sky turned gray, I packed my things. I didn't care about the last 3 days I had paid for. I didn't care if I was overreacting. I wasn't staying another night. As I loaded my truck, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw it. Near the back of the cabin, just below my bedroom window, was a small pile of wood shavings, like something or someone had been carving into the wall. My stomach twisted as I stepped closer. There, etched into the wooden planks, were words, not deep, but clear enough to read. "Leave now." I didn't need to be told twice. I drove straight back to town, barely stopping. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding crazy. A week later, I looked up the history of the cabin. Turns out, it had been abandoned for nearly 20 years before the owner started renting it out. The last person who stayed there before me had left in the middle of the night, just like I did. They never said why. I don't think I want to know.